So I'll finish this lecture by going over the two kinds of objections that Rachel brings up in the chapter to social contract theory and talk about his assessment or evaluation of those objections. So the first objection has to do with whether or not the initial conditions and the characterization of rational agents is perfectly accurate and historically correct. So some theorists criticize social contract theory on the ground that nothing like the state of nature has ever existed historically. So if you go back and you look at humans, and even go back to proto-humans, you never see this kind of state of nature, this nasty, brutish, short war of all against all. Even in, sort of early proto-human existence, hunter-gatherer existence, you still see small social units functioning cooperatively together. Right? You never see a war of all against all, so this argument goes. And the idea here is that, look, if you're trying to argue that we are always rationally constrained to act in a particular way because otherwise the world would be like this, then there ought to be some reason to suppose the world would be like that. And so that's how this argument against the sort of non-fictional and factually accurate nature of the state of nature comes into play. So the idea is, to get normative force, we really have to have descriptions of the world that are accurate about how the world really works. We have to have characterizations of rational agency that are accurate of rational agents. Now, Rachel's notes, and I think most contemporary contract theorists will respond in this way, by indicating that it's not the non-fictional character of the state of nature that provides the normative force for the natural rights and natural laws that are said to characterize the social contract. As Rachel tells us on 95, for the social contract theorist, morality consists in the set of rules governing behavior that rational people will accept on the conditions that others will accept them as well. The idea here is that reason commands us to accept these general principles because we see that the sacrifices that we make and the benefits that we get are in fact the best way of pursuing our own interests. And I think that the social contract theorist really does believe that. So oftentimes social contract theorists will characterize initial conditions in terms of sort of hypothetical ways that the world would work under various conditions, that they don't suppose they're factually accurate of the way the world currently works or the way the world worked in 1900 or even the way the world worked for hunter-gatherers. But they are important rules, say, of economics, so on. Likewise for human rationality. A social contract theorist confronted with seemingly irrational choices made by average human beings would probably respond by saying, look, when I'm talking about rational agency, I'm talking about what would be the rational best course of action dictated in a way that isn't necessarily descriptive, but is normative. Right? What is the best thing to do from the perspective of preserving your own self-interest? Right? And so for this reason, the social contract theorist isn't marrying normativity of our ethical and legal principles, the legitimacy of the Commonwealth, to descriptions of their initial conditions and rational agencies being complete and unvarnished, accurate descriptions of the current or past situation. That's not the source of the normative force on this defense. What about the second objection? Well, some theorists criticize social contract theory on the grounds that prima facie, at first glance, barring other considerations, social contract theory doesn't seem to apply to a whole bunch of different entities: human infants, non-human animals, future generations, or oppressed populations within existent societies. All of these groups seem like groups that either have no motivation to engage in the current social contract or that seem incapable of engaging in social contract. And yet they all seem to be groups that we have ethical and legal obligations to. and that have ethical and legal obligations to us in many cases. And so for Rachel's, this seems to suggest that social contract theory doesn't adequately explain the normative force of our ethical and legal rules or the legitimacy of civil authority. So how would that work? Well, let's take the example of human infants. Human infants just aren't effective agents in the world. They don't behave rationally. That's just a fact about small children. Babies that are 8 months old, they just don't do a lot of utility calculations. So on this account of social contract theory, they're not rational agents. Therefore, they can't participate in the social contract. They're not implicitly accepting it. They're not abiding by its rules. Their behavior isn't regulated by it. They may benefit from it, but they're not sacrificing any of their rights. And the same thing would go for non-human animals. And similar arguments can be made about future generations who can't make sacrifices for benefit because they don't exist in our time. Similarly, we have populations within current societies that aren't treated equitably. So if we have a group of individuals that are oppressed monetarily, legally, they don't have the same civil rights as other groups, all right? But there's no legitimate reason for that. It's not to the benefit of society overall. Then they don't have the motivation to engage in the existing social contract. They should disobey those rules. And so for that reason, social contract doesn't explain why it is that they should be implicitly part of that social contract. So for instance, the standard calculation is women make about 78 cents for every dollar that equally qualified and experienced men make. Well, that's a difference that's not explained by experience or qualifications, and hence it seems like an injustice to us. But that's the way society currently works. They're participating in society. Seemingly they're accepting that contract, but that doesn't seem right. It seems like things like the Lilly Ledbetter Act are laws that try to correct an injustice. And so these are the sorts of arguments that theorists would give in support of this second criticism. And the idea is that these groups seem to fall through the ethical cracks because they're not obviously agents that can enter into the social contract, or they're not obviously agents that would be motivated to enter into the social contracts that they currently inhabit. Right? And so either they can't transfer their rights to gain benefits, or they transfer their rights without appropriate benefits. And for Rachel's, right, he thinks this really is a stake in the heart of social contract theory. So Rachel's tells readers that social contract theory is grounded in self-interest and reciprocity. Thus, it seems unable to recognize the moral duties we have to individuals who can't benefit us. Rachel's thinks that this difficulty doesn't concern some minor aspect of the theory. Right? It goes right to the root of the tree, as he says. This is a devastating objection to him. So what might the social contract theorists say in response to this objection? Well, social contract theorists oftentimes will talk about the agents that enter into the social contract as being broader than the quote-unquote rational agents that are defined. So let's take the example, for instance, of non-human animals. So non-human animals are sentient creatures that experience the aversion to pain. So pain is a sensation, just like it is for human beings. It's adverse, inherently undesirable, just like it is for human beings. And because animals and human beings share this particular element of their agency, they have an implicit social contract with each other whereby human beings can't benefit themselves by inflicting unnecessary pain on animals. Similarly, look at the case of future generations. So future generations can't sacrifice rights to gain benefits from our, say, conserving resources and not engaging in nuclear wars and things of that nature. So in some sense, they can't enter into a contract with us, currently existing people. However, we currently existing people can be seen as having a contract that involves past agents, current agents, and future agents, in which each gains a benefit and makes a sacrifice. So individuals in the past have sacrificed their right to use up all the resources and to wage wars in ways that destroy the environment, et cetera, and they've done that because they've received a benefit from their previous generation who didn't engage in that. Their sacrifice results in our benefit. We benefit from conservation and civility, and as a result, we have an obligation to engage in conservation and civility, thereby passing on that benefit to the future generation, who has a corresponding obligation to pass it on to the next generation, and so on. So, while this is a serious objection, I think the social contract theorist has ways that they can respond. They can adapt the theory to be more inclusive of agents who don't fall naturally under the umbrella portrayed by Hobbes. So when we think about this lecture, we want to make sure we understand what contractarianism is, understand the roles and the nature of those two components, the initial condition and the specification of rational agency. We want to understand how natural rights and natural laws emerge from rational reflection on the combination of the initial condition and rational agency. And we want to make sure that we understand the sorts of objections that can be raised against contractarianism and have been raised by theorists against that view.